Is that some kind of joke? The young pilot's voice sliced through the cabin of the commercial flight, filled with arrogance and a hint of amusement. John Miller didn't react. At 72 years old, he had learned that silence often spoke louder than words. He sat quietly in seat 16A, his eyes focused on the clouds outside the window, the hum of the airplane engine a faint backdrop to the chaos in the cockpit. The pilot, still smirking, glanced at the intercom, then back at the older man sitting in the cramped seat. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, old man, but you're not fooling anyone. Miller remained unmoved, his hands folded neatly in his lap. A flight attendant moved past, glancing nervously at the tension that was beginning to bubble just behind the closed door of the cockpit. Inside, the pilot was getting more agitated, his fingers tapping impatiently against the flight controls. It's your funeral, old-timer, he muttered under his breath as he activated the intercom once again. Let's see if the rest of the passengers get as bored as I am listening to your little story. Just then, a call sign crackled over the comms. Ugly 6, you're cleared for takeoff. I repeat, Ugly 6. The pilot's smirk faltered, his eyes darting toward the communication system. What the hell? He whispered, confused and caught off guard. Ugly 6. His fingers froze, hovering over the switches as he turned to the flight attendants, his tone shifting to one of uncertainty. What's going on back there? What's this nonsense about Ugly 6? But no one could answer. The room fell silent. John Miller, still seated calmly in 16A, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a distant memory. The moment was heavy, thick with a history that was yet to be understood by the young pilot or the flight attendants. Then, over the intercom, the voice of the commander boomed through, sharp and clear. This is Captain Robert Carter speaking. Clear the airspace and prepare for an emergency landing. I need all ground crew to be on standby for Ugly 6. The young pilot's confusion grew as his eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. He glanced back at John Miller, still seated with that calm expression, his weathered face telling stories of years long gone. This is insane, the pilot whispered, his earlier confidence evaporating into thin air. But there was no time for questions. The announcement came again, but this time with urgency, making it clear that the situation was far more serious than anyone had anticipated. Ugly 6, you have priority. I repeat, Ugly 6, you are the most important flight on the radar right now. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some random old man sitting in seat 16A. This wasn't some forgotten passenger on a routine flight. This was a legend, a hero from the past, someone whose call sign held weight far beyond what anyone in the cockpit could comprehend. And the rest of the passengers, now fully aware of the shift in atmosphere, looked on, waiting for the next move, for the inevitable respect that was about to be demanded. The pilot, his mind racing, glanced once more at the calm, silent figure in 16A. He swallowed hard, now fully aware that he had crossed a line. Ugly 6, he murmured under his breath, a sense of reverence creeping into his tone as he saluted the man who had done far more than any of them could ever imagine. The aircraft continued its flight, the hum of the engines the only sound filling the cabin. The tension, however, had shifted. What had been a light-hearted joke between the young pilots and the veteran in seat 16A was now something far more serious. John Miller remained seated, his gaze fixed ahead, his thoughts drifting back to a time when he had been more than just a man on a commercial flight. He had been someone else, someone with a purpose, a man who had been through more than most could ever imagine. He thought of the young soldiers he had led, the countless lives he had touched, and the call signs that had become his identity long before Ugly 6 was ever a name known to anyone outside the military circles. He was a ghost to most, but to a few, he was a legend. The flight continued, but now it was clear that things were not what they seemed. The captain, Lieutenant Tyler Miller, who had been laughing off the name just moments ago, was now gripping the controls with a newfound seriousness. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a quiet understanding that the man in seat 16A was not someone to be mocked. It wasn't long before the intercom crackled to life again, this time with a sense of urgency. This is Captain Carter. We are making an emergency detour. All crew, please prepare for a mid-flight change of course. The captain's voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the gravity in his words. The entire cabin seemed to quiet in response. Passengers exchanged confused glances, but no one dared to question the captain's orders. Lieutenant Tyler Miller, still at the controls, looked at John Miller once more. Something in his expression had shifted. Gone was the cocky, dismissive attitude. In its place was a quiet reverence, a recognition of something far greater than he had realized. As the aircraft veered off its original path, Tyler couldn't help but wonder just who this man in seat 16A really was. As the plane continued to fly, the cabin fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint sound of the intercom announcing that they would be reaching a military airfield soon. The hum of the plane's engines blended with the anticipation that now hung thick in the air. No one knew what was about to happen, but everyone could feel the shift. Lieutenant Miller turned to the flight attendant who had been watching the scene unfold. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low. The flight attendant, who had been silently observing John Miller ever since the call sign had been announced, shrugged, her own expression a mix of curiosity and confusion. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But something tells me this isn't just another passenger." The airfield came into view in the distance, a sprawling military base far below. John Miller remained seated, his hands still folded in his lap, but his mind was far from the plane. It was back on the ground, in a war zone that seemed like a lifetime ago. Back in the days when Ugly Six had meant something to those who knew it, when his name had been spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. The aircraft touched down gently, the wheels kissing the runway with a soft hum. The sudden motion jolted everyone out of their reverie, but the tension remained. No one moved. The flight attendants stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Lieutenant Miller's fingers tightened on the controls, his heart racing. He glanced back at John Miller once more, a final question in his eyes. But John, as always, said nothing. He simply nodded. It wasn't just a nod of acknowledgement. It was a nod of someone who had seen far too much to be surprised by anything anymore. The wheels of the plane came to a stop, and the doors were opened with a heavy hiss. Military personnel flooded the runway, their uniforms sharp and impeccable, their faces cold and professional. Tyler Miller's gaze shifted to the cabin, and he saw them, men in full military regalia, walking with the kind of purpose that only those with a deep understanding of respect and duty possessed. It hit him then. This was no ordinary old man sitting in seat 16A. This was Ugly Six, a living legend. The door opened, and two uniformed officers walked up the aisle with swift precision. They stopped in front of John Miller's seat, their postures rigid with respect. Lieutenant Miller swallowed hard, his hands still on the controls, his mind racing with the realization that this man, this old man, had led lives, had saved lives, and now, here he was. One of the officers, a high-ranking general with 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders, stepped forward, nodding to John. "Sir," he said, his voice full of reverence. "We're ready when you are." Tyler's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced to understand what was happening. What kind of man was this? The general's presence seemed to fill the cabin, the weight of his authority undeniable. John Miller stood slowly, his movements deliberate and steady. He didn't need to say anything. He was Ugly Six, and that was all anyone needed to know. The general stood silently in the aisle, his eyes locked on John Miller, the weight of the moment sinking in for everyone in the cabin. Lieutenant Tyler Miller, who had spent most of the flight mocking the name Ugly Six, now stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had never expected this. He had no idea who John Miller was or what kind of past he carried, but the way the general addressed him, respectful, almost reverent, changed everything. The general's voice cut through the tension, low and commanding. "It is an honor, sir," he said, addressing John Miller with a tone that instantly silenced the entire cabin. "We've been expecting you." Lieutenant Miller stood in the cockpit, his mind reeling as the truth began to sink in. Who was this man? What had he done to earn such respect from the highest ranks of the military? He looked back at the cabin, seeing the other passengers' confused glances, unsure whether to remain seated or rise. John Miller, unfazed by the sudden shift in atmosphere, slowly stood up from his seat. His movements were deliberate, measured. There was no rush. He was a man who had seen far too much to be surprised by anything. He didn't need the fanfare or the attention. He simply nodded to the general, acknowledging the moment, but not needing to speak. The general motioned for the officers to clear a path. The sound of boots clicking on the metal floor of the plane filled the cabin as the military personnel around him adjusted and stood in formation. The respect in the air was palpable. Lieutenant Miller, still in the cockpit, couldn't stop his hands from shaking. The reality was clear now. This was no ordinary old man. This was Ugly Six. The legend he had only heard about in passing was now standing just a few feet away from him, and he had no idea how to process it. The doors to the aircraft opened, and the military personnel outside stood at attention as John Miller made his way down the aisle. As he walked, the general's presence seemed to magnify, each step carrying the weight of decades of service and sacrifice. Lieutenant Miller's eyes never left him, his mind trying to reconcile the man before him with the image of a humble old passenger he had once thought of as nothing more than an inconspicuous traveler. John Miller walked with a quiet grace, but his presence filled the space around him like a storm. He was a man who carried his history without need for explanation. He had been through the darkest times, and those who knew him recognized the value of his silence. As they reached the door of the aircraft, the general turned and faced Lieutenant Miller, his expression hardening for the first time. "You will remember this day," the general said, his voice stern but not unkind. "This is a man who has given more than any of us could ever repay. Show him the respect he deserves." Lieutenant Miller, his chest tight, nodded slowly. His mind was racing, trying to grasp the magnitude of what had just transpired. He had no idea that the man sitting in seat 16A was someone who had lived a life most could only dream of. As the military personnel escorted John Miller off the plane, the cabin remained in stunned silence. The rest of the passengers sat frozen in their seats, absorbing the shift in power that had just occurred. The world outside the plane was no longer the same. What had started as a routine flight was now a moment of reckoning. Lieutenant Miller stood at the cockpit door, staring at the empty seat where John Miller had been just moments before. The flight, which had begun with a simple joke, had turned into something far more meaningful, something he would never forget. He had learned the hard way that legends were never what they seemed. John Miller wasn't just a name. He was a symbol, and Lieutenant Miller now understood that some stories were meant to be heard in silence, not mocked. The plane taxied down the runway, and the general's final words echoed in Lieutenant Miller's mind. "This is a man who has earned his place in history. Don't ever forget that." As the military vehicles drove off the runway, the hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background of John Miller's thoughts. The world outside the aircraft was no longer a place he recognized, but it didn't matter. The world inside the plane, in this moment, was enough. The general's words were still fresh in his mind. This is a man who has earned his place in history. John Miller had lived through moments far more intense than this, but there was something different about this moment. It wasn't the first time he had been recognized for his service, but it was the first time it had happened in such an unexpected way. The silence that had followed him off the plane was heavier than any battlefield he had ever faced. As he made his way through the military convoy, the officers flanking him kept their distance, but their gazes followed him with a reverence he had long since forgotten. He had been a ghost in the military for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be acknowledged. The convoy turned into a small hangar where a few officers were waiting. Their faces were familiar, but the names escaped him. The memories were fading, each passing day taking with it a little more of the man he used to be. Yet, standing here now, in the presence of these young officers, he was reminded of who he once was. They didn't know his name. They didn't know the full extent of his service. But they had seen the respect in the eyes of their superiors, and that was enough to make them silent. "Sir," one of the officers spoke, his voice careful. "We've been instructed to ensure your safety and comfort while you're here." John nodded but didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had lived a life where words were often unnecessary. His actions spoke for him, and they had always done so. "The general will be with you shortly," the officer continued, but John didn't wait for him to finish. He turned and walked towards the far corner of the hangar, his mind already drifting back to the past. He hadn't come here for a reunion. He hadn't come for the recognition. He had come because of a promise made long ago. A promise to a friend, a comrade, a man who had saved his life in a way no one else could ever understand. It wasn't just about being a veteran. It was about the bonds formed in the heat of battle, the ones that lasted long after the war was over. The general arrived moments later, his face unreadable. "You've made quite an impression," the general said, his tone a mixture of respect and curiosity. "I never thought I'd see the day when Ugly Six walked through our doors again." John didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The general knew. The officers around them shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to proceed. They had expected a reunion filled with stories of glory and heroism, but what they got was a man who had lived through more than any of them could ever imagine, and now he was here, standing in silence. "I'm not here for recognition," John said, his voice low but steady. "I'm here to honor a friend. A promise I made." The general nodded, understanding without needing to hear more. He gestured for the officers to step back. The room grew still, the weight of history settling over them like a thick fog. John Miller was no longer just a name from the past. He was a living testament to the sacrifices made, to the friendships forged in blood, and to the promises kept in silence. "You've earned your place, John," the general said, his voice now filled with genuine respect. "And you'll always have it here, with us." John Miller stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the years slip away. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had come home, not because of the recognition, but because of the people who still remembered, who still honored the bonds they had shared. He didn't need to explain himself. He didn't need anyone to understand. His past, his service, his life, it was enough. And that was all he needed. John Miller sat silently in the small room, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound breaking the stillness. The officers had cleared out, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The general's words from earlier still echoed in his mind, and for a moment, it was as if the years had slipped away. He wasn't the forgotten man he had been for so long. In this moment, he was recognized, respected, and his past had come rushing back like a tidal wave. The weight of his memories sat heavy on his chest, but he didn't flinch. He never flinched. He had lived through worse, seen far more than most could ever comprehend. The door opened, and the general stepped in. This time, there was no formality, no stiff posture. The general, a tall and imposing figure, walked over to the desk, his face etched with something deeper than just military professionalism. "John," the general began, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. "I don't know if I can ever truly understand what you went through, what you sacrificed. But I need you to know what you did, what you gave. It wasn't forgotten." John looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting the general's with a quiet intensity. He said nothing, but his gaze spoke volumes. There was no need for words. The general sat down across from him, the weight of the conversation heavy between them. "You know," the general continued, "when they told me you were coming, I thought it was just another name, another old soldier trying to relive the past. But when I saw you in that seat, when I saw the way you carried yourself, it hit me, John. It hit me that we don't just lose soldiers. We lose legends. We lose the stories that should have been told." The general paused, his hands resting on the desk, his knuckles white from the pressure. John could feel the emotion in his voice, the sense of regret that lingered. For a moment, he allowed the general's words to sink in, but then the silence grew too heavy, too uncomfortable. "I wasn't looking for a hero's welcome," John finally said, his voice steady and low. "I'm not here for any of that. I'm here because of a promise I made. To Wallace. To the men I left behind." The general nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. He had seen it before, that kind of quiet resolve, that unwavering loyalty to something greater than oneself. "And you've kept that promise," the general said, his voice thick with respect. "But we're here now, John. It's not too late to let them know who you are, what you've done, the legacy you've built, even if you've kept it hidden all these years." John met the general's gaze, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I don't need to be remembered," he said softly. "I did what I did because it was the right thing to do. Not for glory, not for recognition, just because it was what needed to be done." The general leaned back in his chair, a slow, respectful smile creeping onto his face. "I understand," he said quietly. "But sometimes, John, the world needs to know. They need to understand what people like you gave, what you sacrificed. And we owe it to you to make sure that story is told." John remained silent, his eyes drifting to the window. The world outside was still, peaceful almost, a stark contrast to the turmoil he had experienced over the years. But that was how it always was. Time moved forward, whether you wanted it to or not. And now, it seemed, the world would move with him. "Let's do this," John finally said, his voice steady, almost resolute. The general stood, nodding with a sense of finality. "We'll make sure they hear your story, John. It's time." As John watched the general leave the room, he felt a sense of something. Maybe not closure, but something close to it. The past was never truly gone, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could be remembered in a way that honored the men he had fought beside. He could finally let the world see what he had done, not for fame, but for those who needed him. And that was enough. The next few days were a blur for John Miller. The world had shifted around him, and for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just a relic of the past. As he sat in the quiet room, a sense of finality settled in. The general had kept his word. The story was being told, and the world was beginning to listen. The media buzzed with headlines, and people began to speak of Ugly Six not as a forgotten legend, but as a hero whose actions had shaped the course of history. It wasn't about the medals or the recognition. John knew that. But there was something humbling about hearing his name spoken with respect, something he hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't the recognition he had sought, but rather the acknowledgement of the sacrifices that had been made. The general's team had worked quickly, arranging meetings, interviews, and presentations. John had agreed to speak at one of the veteran events, but only because it was his way of honoring those he had fought beside. He had always preferred the shadows, staying in the background where he could make a difference without the spotlight. But now, it seemed the world needed to know who he was, what he had done, and why it mattered. As the day of the event approached, John felt a quiet unease. It wasn't fear. He had faced far more dangerous situations in his life. But standing in front of a crowd and speaking of his past was different. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The event hall was packed with veterans, families, and dignitaries. The room buzzed with conversation, but as the announcer called his name, a sudden hush fell over the crowd. John stood from his seat, the weight of the moment heavier than he expected. He walked slowly to the stage, his steps deliberate, each one carrying him closer to something he had spent his life avoiding. The spotlight felt strange on his face, but he kept his head steady, his eyes focused on the crowd in front of him. As he reached the podium, the applause was brief, respectful, but there was a sense of recognition in the air. He wasn't just some old veteran anymore. He was Ugly Six, a living piece of history. For a moment, he hesitated. The words he had planned to say seemed distant now, slipping away as the weight of the moment threatened to overwhelm him. But then he remembered the promise he had made. He remembered the faces of the men he had saved, the comrades who had given everything. "I didn't do this for glory," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. I did it because those men needed me, and I wouldn't have done it any other way." The room was silent as they listened to his words. It wasn't about him, John realized. It never had been. It was about them, the ones who had fought beside him, the ones who had made the ultimate sacrifice. He wasn't the hero. They were. And in that moment, John Miller finally understood that his story wasn't just his own. It was theirs. The applause that followed wasn't for him alone. It was for every man and woman who had ever served, every soldier who had given their all, and every life that had been touched by their sacrifices. John stood still, feeling the weight of their gratitude, their respect, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. He had done his duty, and now, he could finally rest knowing that his legacy, the legacy of Ugly Six, would live on in the hearts of those who understood the true cost of freedom. The days following the event felt like a blur to John Miller. The noise of the crowd, the applause, and the flash of cameras seemed distant now, like a memory he could almost reach but couldn't fully grasp. He had been a man who lived in the shadows for so long, and now, the spotlight was on him, and it felt unnatural. The world had changed in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the recognition he had received, but the weight of it, the responsibility that came with being remembered. At times, he felt like a visitor in his own life, unsure of how to move forward. The room he was in now was quiet, just the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the space. He sat at the desk in the small office, his fingers lightly resting on the worn surface. The general's office had been cleared out after the ceremony, and for the first time in days, John was alone with his thoughts. A knock on the door broke the silence, and without waiting for a response, the door creaked open. It was Lieutenant Miller, the same pilot from the flight, the one who had once mocked his call sign and now stood in front of him with a different look in his eyes. The young lieutenant was no longer the cocky, dismissive officer he had been. His posture was respectful, his eyes filled with something John could only describe as understanding. "Sir," the lieutenant said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to apologize for the way I acted. I didn't understand, not fully. I thought I knew what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, but I was wrong." John raised his hand slightly, signaling the lieutenant to stop. There was no need for apologies, no need for words that didn't carry the weight of truth. He had seen enough of that over the years. "You've got nothing to apologize for," John said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had long since learned the value of silence. "You did what you thought was right, and you're here now, learning. That's all that matters." The lieutenant nodded, his face softening. He didn't say anything more, but the weight of his gratitude was clear. John had seen it in the young men and women he had fought beside in the past. It wasn't about the words they spoke. It was about the way they carried themselves when they realized the depth of the responsibility they had been given. The lieutenant stepped forward and placed something on the desk. It was a small, worn leather pouch. John's eyes flickered to it, his fingers instinctively reaching out to touch it. He hadn't expected to see it again. "I thought you might want this back," the lieutenant said, his voice soft. John opened the pouch slowly, and inside was the familiar, faded patch, the one that had been worn by so many of his brothers and sisters in arms. The patch of his old unit. The one that had been with him through the worst of it all. He ran his fingers over the worn fabric, feeling the memories flood back. The battles, the sacrifices, the lives lost. And yet, here it was, as if it had been waiting for him to take it back. A symbol of everything he had once been, and everything he had fought for. "Keep it," John said, his voice steady. "It belongs with you now." The lieutenant hesitated but then nodded, a sense of understanding passing between them. He took the patch and tucked it into his uniform pocket, as if he had just received a piece of history that would change him forever. John watched him leave, the door clicking softly behind him. Alone again, he sat back in his chair and stared out the window. The world outside was still, but for the first time in a long time, John felt something stir within him. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was something close. The weight of the past still rested on his shoulders, but now, there was a sense of purpose to it. He had done his part, and now, it was time for the next generation to carry the torch. John leaned back, his hand still resting on the patch. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a small smile. Maybe the world would be all right after all. The following weeks passed in a haze of interviews, ceremonies, and moments of quiet reflection for John Miller. The noise of the world outside, the media's obsession with his past, the newfound recognition, none of it seemed to matter. What mattered to him was the quiet moments, the ones where he could sit in peace and remember the faces of those who had fought alongside him. Those were the moments he cherished, the ones that carried real meaning. The world had caught up with him, but it was a world that seemed strange, unfamiliar, as if he was being asked to fit into a life that no longer belonged to him. Yet, there were times, brief moments in the quiet of the night or the stillness of his office, where the weight of the past lifted just enough for him to breathe. The general had kept his promise. The stories had been told. The legacy was secure. But John didn't feel different. He didn't feel like the hero they now claimed him to be. He was still just a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. On one particular morning, after a long stretch of silence, there was a knock at his door. It was Lieutenant Miller again, standing there with a hesitant look on his face, as if unsure how to enter the space that had once been filled with tension and uncertainty. John didn't say anything at first. He just motioned for the lieutenant to sit, watching him with a calm gaze that had become second nature. The lieutenant stepped inside, his hands still stiff with the respect he now had for the older man. "Sir," the lieutenant began, his voice uncertain, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About what we owe." John nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he listened. The lieutenant had been struggling with the weight of it all, and John knew it. He had seen it in the young men he had trained, those who thought they understood what service meant until they were confronted with the true cost of it. "You're not the only one who gave something," the lieutenant continued, his voice gaining strength. There are others, people like me who get caught up in the mission, and we forget that it's about the people, the ones who fought beside us. John leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking slightly under his weight. He knew the lieutenant was struggling with something. He had seen it before, the burden of responsibility. It was a weight no one else could carry. You're learning, John said quietly. And that's all that matters. You can't change what's been done, but you can change how you carry it forward. That's what matters. The lieutenant nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. There was a brief silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind that only comes when two people understand the weight of what has been said. I'll carry that with me, the lieutenant said finally, his voice firm with resolve. And I'll make sure they know what you did. What you all did. John didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was enough. It always had been. The lieutenant left a few moments later, leaving John to his thoughts once again. He sat there for a long while, staring out of the window. The world outside seemed so different now, as if it had shifted in a way he couldn't quite comprehend. But in the quiet of his office, surrounded by memories, John Miller understood one thing. His work wasn't done. The next generation, the ones who had come after him, would carry the torch now. And that was all he had ever wanted. To know that the lessons, the sacrifices, the bonds made in battle, would continue to mean something long after he was gone. The world would remember, but it was up to them to keep it alive. John had done his part, and now, it was time for them to carry on the legacy. The weeks that followed were quieter, but the shift in John Miller was unmistakable. He had come to terms with his place in the world, or at least, he had accepted the role he was now expected to play. The media, the veterans associations, and even the younger officers began to see him not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a bridge to a past they needed to understand. The recognition had been strange at first, but now, it was almost comforting. His story wasn't just his own anymore. It belonged to the men and women who had served with him, to those who came after him, and to everyone who had ever answered the call to duty. John spent most of his days in quiet reflection, visiting the local Veterans Center, talking to the younger veterans, and sharing his experiences. He had never been one for speeches or large gatherings, but he found solace in these one-on-one conversations. It was in those moments, when he saw the gratitude and the understanding in the eyes of the younger veterans, that he realized his purpose was not just to be remembered, it was to pass on the lessons he had learned. One afternoon, as he sat at the center, a young man approached him, his face hesitant but filled with curiosity. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, his voice respectful. "I've heard a lot about you. I just wanted to say thank you for everything you did." John looked up from his coffee, his eyes studying the young man. "You're welcome," John replied quietly, his voice steady. "But I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it needed to be done." The young man nodded, a slight smile forming on his face. "That's what I've been hearing," he said, "that you never did it for the recognition. But still, we owe you more than we can ever repay." John gave a small nod, his gaze drifting back to the window. "It's not about repayment," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of service. "It's about understanding. It's about remembering why we fight, why we serve." The young man seemed to take those words to heart, nodding as if he had finally understood something he had been struggling with. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, before turning and walking away. As the young man left, John couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of fulfillment. It wasn't the recognition, it wasn't the accolades. It was moments like this that made everything worth it. The idea that the next generation understood the importance of what they were doing and why they did it. In the days that followed, John continued his routine, visiting the center, talking to anyone who needed guidance, and sharing his experiences with those who were willing to listen. He had come to realize that the impact he had made in the military wasn't just about his actions on the battlefield. It was about the lessons he had passed down, the wisdom that had been earned through years of sacrifice. It was about ensuring that the values of honor, duty, and respect didn't fade away with time. One evening, as he sat in his quiet home, he looked out at the stars, the memories of his comrades filling his thoughts. They were still with him, their spirits woven into the fabric of his life. He had kept his promise to them. And now, it was time for the next chapter, for the young veterans to take up the mantle and carry it forward. The world had changed, but the core values that had driven him, and so many others, remained the same. John Miller wasn't done yet. He may have passed the baton, but his legacy would continue in the hands of those who understood the true cost of freedom. The months passed, and John Miller continued to find himself in places he never thought he would return to. The conversations with young veterans, the meetings with high-ranking officers, and the endless stream of media requests slowly became the backdrop to a life he hadn't truly expected. Yet, despite the whirlwind of attention and the constant reminders of his past, there was a sense of peace that had settled over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came with forgetting. It was a peace born out of acceptance of the fact that his story, his legacy, was no longer just his own. He had given everything he could, and now, the next generation was picking up the torch. One afternoon, John was invited to speak at a ceremony at the Veterans Memorial Park, a place dedicated to honoring the lives of those who had served. It wasn't a large event, but it was important. The park had been recently renovated, and this ceremony was to mark the completion of the new monument that would stand in the heart of the park, a monument to those who had given everything in the name of freedom. John arrived early, as was his custom. He stood by the new monument, his eyes scanning the names engraved on the stone, the names of men and women he had once known, those who had fought alongside him. He ran his fingers over the surface, each name a reminder of the past, each one a story that deserved to be remembered. As the crowd gathered, John noticed a young woman standing nearby. She was in her early 20s, wearing a uniform that marked her as a soldier. She stood quietly, her eyes focused on the monument, her expression unreadable. John approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. When she noticed him, she straightened up and saluted him. "Sir," she said, her voice respectful but tinged with a quiet sadness. "I didn't expect to see you here today. It's an honor." John smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "It's an honor to be here," he replied. "This park, this monument, it's not just for the ones who are gone. It's for the ones still here, too." The young woman nodded, her gaze drifting back to the names etched into the stone. "I never met them," she said quietly, "but I've heard the stories. I've read about what they did, what you did." John felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "We did what we had to do," he said, his voice steady. "But the stories are theirs. Not mine. Not anymore." The young woman looked at him, her eyes full of admiration and understanding. "But they wouldn't be remembered without you," she said softly. John shook his head, his expression gentle. "They'll be remembered, no matter what. The people who matter will always remember. And the ones who come after us, they'll make sure the stories live on." As the ceremony began, John stood in the background, watching as the monument was unveiled. The crowd clapped, some with tears in their eyes, others with quiet reverence. But John didn't need the applause. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. He was content knowing that the monument, the names, and the stories would remain long after he was gone. The young woman approached him again after the ceremony, her face filled with a quiet sense of gratitude. "Thank you, sir," she said, "for everything. For making sure we remember." John nodded, his gaze softening. "It's not just about remembering," he said. "It's about making sure we never forget why we fought, and why we still fight today." As he left the park, John felt the weight of the years pressing down on him, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a reminder that the past had shaped the future, and the future was in good hands. The torch had been passed, and he could finally rest, knowing that his story, and the stories of those who had fought beside him, would never be forgotten. It was a quiet morning when John Miller received the call. He had been expecting it, in a way. The days had settled into a peaceful rhythm, but something told him that his time to step back into the world, even for just a moment, had not yet come. The general's voice on the other end was calm, but there was an urgency to it that John didn't miss. "John," the general began, "we need you." There was a pause, and John could hear the weight of the words that followed. "We've got a mission, and we need someone who understands what it means to lead, to make the tough calls." John took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pull of duty. It had been years since he had stepped onto the battlefield, but some things never left you. The training, the instincts, the responsibility, it was always there, buried deep. "I'm not the man you're looking for anymore," John replied, his voice steady but tinged with the understanding of someone who had lived through it all. "The world's moved on. The world may have moved on, But the work is still the same, John, the general said, his tone softening. We need you now, not for your past, but for what you can still offer. The younger generation, they don't have the experience you do. We need you to help guide them, to remind them what it really takes. John sat quietly for a moment, the sound of the general's words settling over him. He knew what the general meant. The younger veterans, those who had come after him, had their own strengths. But there were things they hadn't learned yet, things that only came with time. And it wasn't about the medals, the recognition, or the glory. It was about the people, the men and women who had given everything, and the ones who had to keep moving forward after the dust had settled. Where do you need me? John asked, his voice steady once more. We're coordinating a new training program. It's a big job, and it's going to take all of us, the general replied. It's not just about the mission. It's about making sure that the legacy we leave behind is one they can carry forward. You know what that means. John nodded to himself, even though the general couldn't see it. He knew exactly what it meant. He had spent his life ensuring that the lessons learned, the sacrifices made, were never forgotten. And now, it seemed, it was time to teach the next generation how to carry that responsibility. As John arrived at the training facility, the young faces around him were a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. They had heard the stories, seen the headlines, and yet there was a hesitation in their eyes. They didn't know him, not the real John Miller, not the one who had been through the fire and lived to tell the tale. But that was about to change. As he walked into the room, his presence commanded the space. The room fell silent. John didn't need to say anything. He simply stood there, observing the young men and women in front of him. They were eager, but there was something in their eyes that spoke of inexperience, something that John recognized all too well. This isn't about the uniform, he began, his voice low and firm. This isn't about the medals. It's about the people you fight for, the people who depend on you when it counts the most. You are the ones who will carry the weight of everything that came before you. Don't forget that. The room was still, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He could feel their attention, their uncertainty, and their need to understand. I've been where you are, and I know what it feels like to think you have all the answers. But there's always more to learn. And the day you stop learning is the day you fail. John paused, his eyes sweeping over the room, seeing their faces, seeing their determination. I'm here to make sure you don't make the same mistakes I did. I'm here to teach you how to carry that weight with honor, how to lead with integrity, and how to make sure that the legacy we leave behind is one that can never be forgotten. The silence in the room was deep now, but it wasn't the awkward silence of doubt. It was the silence of respect, the kind that only comes when someone has lived through the hardest battles and come out the other side still standing. As John began the training, he could see the shift in the room. The young veterans were no longer just following orders. They were starting to understand what it meant to lead, to fight for something greater than themselves. And as the day went on, John felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. The next generation was beginning to understand. And he knew that, in the end, it was their story that mattered now. But for the moment, it was his job to guide them, to help them find their way. And that, for John Miller, was enough. The training continued, day after day, as John Miller worked with the younger veterans, teaching them not just the technical skills they needed, but the deeper lessons that could not be learned from a manual. He had seen it all, the best and the worst of what military service could bring, and he knew that the true strength of a soldier wasn't in their ability to follow orders, but in their ability to think for themselves, to lead, and to make the right decision when the stakes were highest. The younger veterans had been eager at first, but John could see the exhaustion starting to set in. The reality of what they were learning, the weight of it, was beginning to hit them. They had come to him for guidance, and now they were starting to understand what that really meant. There was one young woman, Sergeant Emma Grant, who stood out from the others. She had been quiet during the first few days of training, keeping to herself, but John noticed that she asked the most thoughtful questions. It wasn't that she didn't know the answers, she did. It was that she was looking for something more, something deeper. One afternoon, after the day's session, she approached John, her expression hesitant but determined. "Sir," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I need to ask you something." John looked up from the paperwork he was sorting through and gave her a small nod. "What's on your mind, Sergeant?" "I've been thinking," she began, her eyes meeting his, "about everything you've taught us. And I guess I guess I'm just trying to figure out if I'm really ready for this. For what comes next? John leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. He had seen this before. The moment when the weight of responsibility finally hit, when the reality of what it meant to lead became clearer. It's normal to feel that way, John said, his voice calm and reassuring. There's no manual for this. You can't always be prepared for what comes next. But that's part of the job. Sergeant Grant looked down for a moment, her fingers twisting around the strap of her uniform. I keep thinking about the people who are counting on me, she said quietly. The ones who depend on me to make the right calls. And I'm scared that I'll mess it up. John studied her for a moment, seeing the conflict in her eyes, the fear of failure that so many had felt before her. He had felt it too, many years ago. But he had learned something important along the way. You will mess up, he said softly. We all do. But that's not what defines you. What matters is how you pick yourself up afterward, how you learn from it, and how you use it to become a better leader. Sergeant Grant looked up at him, her expression still unsure. But what if I'm not strong enough? She asked. John smiled gently, the corners of his eyes creasing as he leaned forward. Strength isn't about never failing, he said. It's about what you do when you fall. It's about getting back up, standing tall, and moving forward with everything you've learned. For the first time in days, Sergeant Grant's shoulders seemed to relax, the tension in her face easing just a little. She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. I think I understand, she said quietly. Thank you, sir. John watched her walk away, the weight of her doubts still lingering in her steps, but he knew she would get there. He had seen it in so many others before her. The moment when the fear of failure was replaced with the quiet confidence of someone who knew they could keep going, no matter what. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about perseverance. The days passed, and John continued to work with the younger veterans, sharing everything he had learned, every hard lesson, every victory, and every defeat. He was no longer just teaching them how to be soldiers. He was teaching them how to be leaders, how to carry the responsibility of what it meant to serve, and how to pass on the lessons that would shape the next generation. And in the quiet moments, when the training was over and the day had ended, John would sit alone in his office, staring out the window at the world that had changed so much. It wasn't the world he had once known, but it didn't matter. He had done his part, and the future was in good hands. The days grew longer, and the weight of what John Miller had done began to settle in. It was a quiet satisfaction, the kind that came after a lifetime of service, of making sure that the next generation was ready to step into the roles they would inherit. He had seen them grow, these young veterans, their faces no longer filled with uncertainty, but with a resolve that spoke of their own journey. Sergeant Emma Grant, who had once questioned her own strength, now stood as one of the most respected leaders in their unit. She had embraced the lessons John had shared, and the change in her was noticeable to everyone. John had watched her develop into someone who could command respect not just by the strength of her words, but by the integrity of her actions. The others followed her lead. It was no longer about the accolades, the medals, or the recognition. It was about what they could give to the mission, to their comrades, and to the future. John's role had always been to prepare them for that, to ensure that they understood the true essence of leadership. It wasn't about power or control. It was about responsibility. The bond between soldiers, once forged in battle, was something that transcended time. It was about loyalty to each other, to the mission, and to the ideals they fought to protect. And that was what John had passed on, in his own quiet way. As the months went on, John found himself retreating more and more from the spotlight. He still visited the Veterans Center, still spoke to the young soldiers who sought him out for guidance, but the recognition had faded into the background. The legacy he had worked so hard to build was now in the hands of those who would carry it forward. And for John, that was enough. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his small house, the sun dipping below the horizon, John thought back on his life. The memories came in waves, each one distinct, each one a part of the story that had defined him. The battles, the sacrifices, the men and women he had fought alongside, they were all there, in his mind, as vivid as the day they had happened. But there was peace now, a kind of quiet acceptance that he had done what he could. The world was moving forward, and the next chapter was theirs to write. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie, and he turned to see Sergeant Grant approaching, a small smile on her face. "Sir," she said, her voice steady. I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. For showing us what it means to be a leader. John nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It's not about me, Emma. It's about all of you. You've taken what I've taught you and made it your own. That's the real legacy. She nodded in return, her eyes filled with gratitude. We won't forget it, sir. I promise. And with that, she turned and walked away, her figure fading into the distance as John sat back in his chair, looking out at the setting sun. The world was changing, but the things that truly mattered, the lessons learned, the bonds forged, would always remain. He had done his part. And now, it was time for the next generation to carry the torch forward. The weight of the past was still there, but John knew that it would never be too much for them to bear. They were ready. And in the end, that was all he had ever hoped for.